Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Where Work Meets Life. I'm Dr. Laura, and I'm thrilled to bring an episode about overwork, transforming the daily grind in the quest for a better life with Brigid Schulte. And I'm going to tell you a bit about Brigid Schulte in a moment because she's absolutely an outstanding human and contributor to a lot of issues that are facing society and workplaces today. And overwork is a systemic and serious issue I see across organizations that I work with in North America and can relate to in various points of my own life where I've been a high achiever and, 3 children, 2 businesses, always a lot going on. So I can relate to this topic very well. And I imagine a lot of you can relate to the overwork in your lives. In season 4, my last season, I brought on Dr. Melissa Clark, a fellow industrial organizational psychologist and author, to speak on how the always on work cultures are bad for business. Melissa introduced me to Brigid Schulte and said I must speak to her. And funny enough, I had her last book on my shelf. And for those of you watching on YouTube, it is called Overwhelmed, and it is a fabulous read. So I had that book on my shelf already, and I learned that Bridget was publishing a new book called Overwork, Transforming the Daily Grind in the Quest for a Better Life, which has launched this month. So you can find it all over on your favorite book platforms. And the book illuminates the quality of life crisis that we're facing when it comes to work and how overwork is impacting human lives. And as people search for more meaning and purpose in their work, this book is a timely contribution. So, Brigid Schulte, who is she? Well, she is a journalist, a think tank program director, a keynote speaker, and author of this best-selling book, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And she's an award-winning journalist for the Washington Post and the Washington Post magazine, and was part of the team that won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize, so no small feat. She's currently director of the Better Life Lab, the Work, Family Justice, Care, and Gender Equity Change program at New America, and she hosts the Better Life podcast on Slate. Her work has appeared all over the place, publications like the Harvard Business Review, Financial Times, Fast Company, the list goes on. Welcome to the show, Brigid.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I am just amazed at your bio, but tell me a little bit more about yourself personally and what led you to this passion to transform work and lives.
Yeah, it's sort of an accidental path, I have to say. So, where do you want me to start? I was born. No, I grew up in Oregon. Where I loved it. It was very rainy, so I read a lot as a kid, and I just really loved stories. And then I got into journalism, and I always just found it so fascinating that people's lives and stories were so much richer and deeper in many ways than a lot of the fiction that you could read. And yet what I loved was the way that fiction could just transport you into a different world. And so I've tried to bring some of the qualities of what I love about storytelling and fiction into what I love about journalism, which is really kind of taking that, almost almost of a poetic view of modern life, and bring that into the journalism that I do. And so worked at a number of different newspapers over the years, wrote for magazines, spent most of my career at the Washington Post. I like to say I started when my son was 8 months old, and I left when he was 6'4". So I was there for quite some time. I have 2 kids. Just the loves of my life. My husband's also a journalist, so lots and lots of interesting conversations around the dining room table. And I think I fell into this particular kind of area of inquiry, if you will. I was a narrative writer at the Washington Post, and I ended up sort of accidentally writing this magazine story about time and kind of how it feels, and certainly my time, what it felt like as a as a mother of two young kids who was, working full time in a paid job. You're also, let's face it, working full time at an unpaid job. Women are still doing at least twice the amount of time doing housework and childcare, even now, even when they're the breadwinner, so just carrying a heavy load and just, and all of the conversation was like, well, this is just the way it is. It's just, suck it up. And just kind of accidentally writing about that. It's like, oh, they tell me to suck it up, and this guy tells me I have 30 hours of leisure. I'm like, he's out of his mind. I can barely make it to the end of the day. And then that book ended up becoming the book of sort of like looking for like, well, why don't I have leisure? And why is it so? Why do people feel so, burdened by time pressure? And it was through the lens of my experience, through the lens of a lot of people's experience, kind of using my skills as an investigative and explanatory journalist, looking at a lot of statistics and research, and really treating kind of motherhood and work and unpaid care in a really serious and substantive way that I hadn't seen. And so a lot of the stuff that had been written at that point had been, I like to call it the mommy train wreck kind of books. Like, oh, we're so busy, it's so crazy, ha ha ha, let me pour a big glass of wine. And it was so unsatisfactory, And so I think I wanted to take that kind of more serious-minded look at my own life, kind of as a journalist. If I were going to report this out, what would I find? And I remember the morning that the magazine piece and then my book came out, I was sort of curled in the fetal position. I told my editor, it's like, I'm going to be honest enough to the point where I don't get fired. I just really felt like I buried a lot of my dirty laundry, a lot of stuff I wasn't very proud of, a lot of stuff that we think, well, what's wrong with you? Everybody else has it together. Look at their Instagram feeds. You're a mess. You're neurotic. You just can't figure it out. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from that was learning how I wasn't alone, and that so many people felt that way. And it wasn't just, I don't want to say just, but it was certainly women and mothers, but it was also anyone with care responsibilities. It was men who felt this way. We were all sort of silently suffering and yearning for some kind of, meaningful work, but time for love and care and connection, and even this like space for joy and play and leisure time. And so it was a really profound journey, honestly. I changed a lot. I learned a lot. And then that led me to come back. I had my fellowship to write the book here at New America. I'm in my office today, and I really loved it. There are a lot of journalists and storytellers here, so it's not because I'm not a policy wonk. And in fact, I really hesitated. I felt like, oh, policy's boring. But I learned, it's like, no, policy shapes our lives. We really got to care about this stuff. And so it really kind of opened my eyes. And so now I'm trying to help using story and using journalism, translating really excellent academic literature like Melissa Clark and others do, kind of helping bring that out in an accessible and approachable way to help us all like understand more clearly the water that we're swimming in, and really have a conversation about like, well, how can work change? How can, the way we talk about gender and the way we think about gender equality, how can that change? How can our, public policies change? What about our attitudes and our cultural attitudes and behaviors and expectations? So kind of how do we move that forward? And really the driving force in all of this, the work that I do at the Better Life Lab and all the journalism I do, is really, how can we all have an equal, fair shot at living a good life? It's really all about like, kind of why are we here on Earth? How can we live? How can we live well? I love it. Brene Brown says, kind of like live a wholehearted life. I think that's sort of what really drives me, and what needs to change in order to get there, and how can we do it in a way that's equitable and fair.
Beautifully put, Brigid. So what I'm understanding is overwork really builds upon your last book by looking at the bigger picture issues in society as well.
Yeah, with overwork, I started reporting it, honest to God, the minute I finished Overwhelmed. And I think because what I realized at the end of writing Overwhelmed is that so much of the pain and misery and the expectation of always being on, it's really driven by work culture. And in particular, It's not only in the United States, but I would say it originates. It's driven by that kind of like hyper-focused, work-devoted American culture that sadly is getting exported around the world. And so I really wanted to do a deep dive into work. What is it about work? Why is there overwork? What are the consequences? What are the causes? Why should we care about it? But more than anything, just like an overwhelmed, I went looking for solutions and answers. I'm driven by looking for like, well, where is it better? What can we learn? Because if all I did was go around the world and talk about how terrible things are, I wouldn't want to get out of bed in the morning. So I'm looking for hope. Well, what can I learn? And so every chapter follows change agents who are not just trying to change like the surface level, like the lunchtime yoga or a few more bucks an hour for an hourly worker, but really trying to change the way we think about, organize, and do work, the very systems and structures of work. All around the world. I focus a lot in the United States, but I also have a chapter in Japan. I went there on a fellowship to really try to, I like, how do you change a culture where overwork is so common that people die? And there's a word for it. So I went there and I spent time with families and labor lawyers and unions and how they're really trying to change laws and regulations and policy. I spent time in Iceland where the entire country now, 85% of the workforce has access to short work hours because they made this real commitment to gender equality and well-being, and they saw that this was one way to do that. And, I spent time in Scotland where they looked at how important care is, and how what would it look like if you really centered human well-being and care as the way you measured success in the economy rather than GDP and constant growth and, profits for the handful of the few. So, and then I spent time here in the United States with companies that are doing really fascinating, innovative things with work redesign and what's sticking, and with worker movements who are fighting for quality of life, for stable schedules. And so it's really looking at who's changing things and how and what could we learn.
Wow. So a lot of on the ground research in real companies, real organizations. I think that's fascinating. And I can't wait to dig a bit more into that. And I know that you're a self proclaimed optimist. You have a lot of hope for the future. But when it comes to the challenges, Bridget, what are the most pressing challenges facing today's overworked humans?
That's such a good question, and I've given this one a lot of thought. So I would say three things, and the first one is really the most urgent, and that is, Jeff Pfeffer is a wonderful professor at Stanford. He wrote a book called Dying for a Paycheck, and he and his colleagues have done some really influential work. And there's others in the book that I profile, Peter Schnall and Marnie Dobson with the Healthy Work Campaign. It is astounding how prevalent work stress is and how dangerous and damaging it is. They've done a study where they've looked at 10 what they call psychosocial stressors at work. And these are not like, falling off a ladder or a coal mine, or working in a coal mine, sort of things that we think about as sort of like the dangers with work. These are things like having a toxic boss, not having access to health insurance or health care, working long hours, having work-family conflict, feeling like your boss doesn't appreciate you, working harder and not getting enough rewards. I mean, hello, am I describing just about every workplace out there? So work stress is really prevalent. And what they're finding is that it leads to either you can have acute symptoms, that lead to heart attack and stroke in the moment when you're super stressed out or you're working long hours. It wasn't that long ago that, Bank of America, this poor guy, junior banker working, 100-hour weeks, and then he falls over with like a blood clot in his heart. So we have those acute moments of, I would call them karoshi. We do have American karoshi. We just don't recognize it. But the other thing that's probably more insidious is that when you have that constant stress and you're constantly worried and, or you're worried about, the layoffs that might be coming, there's a sense of precarity, no matter where you are in the workforce. If you have a low wage job, you could be out tomorrow. But so could you at one time. Those knowledge jobs were much more stable. They're not anymore. So everybody's sort of on pins and needles and worried, and kind of the stress is high. And so when your body's constantly being bathed in that kind of cortisol bath, what the research shows that you don't have, maybe you're exhausted, you get home at the end of the day, you don't feel like doing a workout or even taking a walk. You don't really have time to go to the grocery store, so you just pick up fast food, and then you're eating stuff that might not be all that nutritious. And over time, that could lead to things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, you know, diabetes. And there's research that shows that the way we work, simply the way we work, the stress has become the 5th leading cause of death in the United States. So that's huge. And that's why we should care about overwork, number one. Number two, this notion that that if you overwork, that somehow it's a choice, that you're at fault, or that the individual is to blame, or that you can't handle it, or that you're just not organized enough. If you're in a knowledge job, or that you didn't get enough education, or you're not motivated enough to do something, if you're in a low wage job. And I think what was so powerful in a lot of the reporting that I did for this book is to see how much of the problem is not with individuals, although it's easier to blame them. So then say the solution is something the individual needs to figure out. But you're not going to bubble bath your way out of low wages. You're not going to breathe deeply and fix a workload that's way too much for any one person to do. And you've got a huge workload because your company just right-sized and cut half the people, and now you're doing 3 people's jobs. And that's pervasive. So I think the second thing that I found is that, we overwork in different ways. Knowledge workers tend to overwork in one job, because they're expected to. That's sort of the ideal worker norm. But we've created, I call it sort of the crapification of jobs. We have now so many low wage jobs that don't pay enough to support a human life, so that you have to overwork in 2 or 3 jobs, or a gig and a side hustle, or trying to find public benefits, or just worrying. So everybody is sort of overworking across the board. And I guess the last thing that I would say is why this is so important is what is work for? It used to be we'd work for our daily bread, right? And we'd have this sense of that we'd get some sense of meaning and purpose out of it. But anymore, it really feels like, when you think of a future of work, and now there's going to be more automation, and maybe there's going to be less work to go around. I think we really need to be thinking a lot about, what is the point of work, and what is work? And I argue that we need to think much differently about what work is. That work is not only what we do for pay, it is also all of the unpaid work of care and home that women have mainly done for generations. I mean, there's research that shows if we counted that in just with minimum wages, all of that unpaid work would be about $10 trillion of value a year. So there's so much that's been invisible. We need to consider that work. But we also need to be thinking about the contributions we make to our communities, to our society, and thinking about sort of reclaiming the sense of why we work, not necessarily for personal enrichment or GDP growth or the stock market, that just fosters more and more inequality. We need to be thinking about how do we make things better for people? What is the common good? And how do we get to shared prosperity? And what does work look like when we have a different idea of what success looks like, that it isn't necessarily a whole lot of money for a few people, which is kind of where we are with really grotesque inequality. What does it look like when we have meaningful work that, that's good work, that's fair, and that leads to better things for all of us?
Absolutely. And I see that search for meaning at all levels. So at the executive level, people finding that they're not having the meaning and purpose. So I think it affects all levels at work. And I think that you make a really good point. The overwork can affect everyone from the hourly laborer to the CEO, and it has equally disastrous effects for either livelihood. Either life, not livelihood, but life, like the meaning and satisfaction and happiness and joy and health of your life.
Yeah. And it's interesting. A lot of times when you look at some of the literature around work, I've been surprised that that there's sort of this sense that only people who have educated, who've gone through college and have knowledge sort of desk level jobs, that they're the only ones that get meaning out of their work. Well, if you go all the way back to it's not that long ago, but Studs Terkel, and you really talk to people, So this book is a lot of journalism. It tells a lot of other people's stories. I don't really play a role in it, well, except in the workaholics chapter, where I feature Melissa and me, and our struggle with workaholic tendencies, I suppose is the best way to put it. You know, um, but when you talk to people, so they get so much joy and value out of what they do. I mean, I've talked to retail workers and they take such pride in even the way they stock the shelves. Or you talk to like a home care worker and they take such joy in knowing exactly what their client, like how they like to have their hair fixed and knowing what music to play or what food they like. So I think it's really important that we restore the sense of dignity that people take in the work that they do. You know, and really kind of respect that it's not just people who are, highly educated that work matters for them. It's, people tend to think, well, it's just a paycheck for so many other people. It is and it isn't. We all have that sense that we want to have purpose and meaning in our lives. And for many of us, work plays a really important function that way.
I agree, and I think that the more that we can respect and be grateful for all the different workers in our lives, right? From the janitor to the, grocery store worker to everybody that makes a difference and not, shame them for not being college educated or whatever, because we need all the folks to make this world go around.
And so what we really need, frankly, is those are the jobs that have become such crummy jobs. They don't pay a living wage. They don't have living hours. They don't have benefits. It's really hard to make ends meet. Why not make jobs good jobs? Why do we accept low wage work in like in the United States? I think one of the things that shocked me is that 44% of the workforce, that's nearly half the workforce in the United States, is considered low wage. In the wealthiest country on earth, that's wrong. So when I say we need to restore dignity is not just understand that, the janitor or the retail worker finds meaning in their work, but let's make sure that those jobs are big enough to support human life.
Exactly. I think this is such a beautiful point. And in your research, so you explore different cultures. I'm curious about your Japan experience with the high level of work-related suicide that Japan was facing and what you learned there about what they've done to counteract that, Bridget.
So it was a fascinating and really eye-opening trip. I had lived in Japan before, right out of college, so I had a number of friends, and I was somewhat familiar with the sort of like the long work hours culture. You often, this is back in the 80s, you'd be out on a Saturday night and, you would see all of these office, salarymen is what they would call them. And there's a culture where you go out drinking after work and they would just be hammered. And it'd be late at night and they'd still be with their work colleagues. And I just remember thinking, like, what a way to live. I mean, that's an expectation of work. So that's part of their overwork culture that's very unique to Japan. So I had seen a little snippets of it, but when I went back to like really dig into it, there were things that were surprising and things that were not surprising, I should say. And I guess what was surprising is that in the West, we would hear or we read or we'll hear about sort of a karoshi suicide or a death, and we'll think, oh my gosh, that's so terrible, and it must have something to do with, and you'll see it, Japanese samurai culture or this Bushido culture of the warrior. And so we kind of dismiss it as if it's this almost, exotic or cultural kind of issue. And I think when I went there, what surprised me is that it's not that at all. They overwork for the same reasons we overwork here. The expectation, the feeling that there isn't any other choice. And frankly, a lot of why they overwork is inefficiency. A lot of our overwork in the United States is also driven by inefficiency. You have meeting cultures and, and then, work changes, but you never change your processes. You never sort of look at how you could most effectively do your work. And part of that is because culturally, we have come to value the people, sort of the quote unquote ideal worker norm, the people who put in the longest hours. You're here early, you're there late. Or now with digital work, oh my gosh, they're sending emails at 3 a.m. They must be so dedicated. And so we have these sort of perverse rewards and values that then drive a lot of that culture and behavior. It's the same thing that we have here in the United States. And I think what was amazing first of all, when I was there, almost everybody that I talked to had some kind of karoshi story. Either they knew somebody who had died, or they knew somebody who'd gotten so sick they nearly died. I spoke to so many people who'd been in that situation. And then when you talk to them and see, like, well, what were you doing? Or why was it like this? One guy said, well, you can't leave the office until your boss does, and the boss never leaves because they've got this sort of like notion that the later you stay, the better you are, the better worker you are. But it's not based on performance. It's not based on output. It's not based on any measure of like even profitability. It's just sort of your cultural belief. So this one guy was just like, yeah, so I didn't have anything to do. So I would just stand at the copy machine and make blank copies so I would look busy. And so I think that to me it was eye-opening and infuriating and really tragic that a lot of people are dying to meet some false notion of what a good worker is that actually has absolutely nothing to do with good work. And we do that here in the United States as well. And so I think, a lot of my solutions one of the best things that I ever heard from somebody from the 4 work week movement or the shorter work week movement, they're like, a short work hours, it's really just like an organizational excellence mission in disguise. And that's exactly what it is. Because to do short work hours, you are forced to go through your day like in 15-minute increments and really get clear on what's my value, what's my output, what am I really doing here, what's the important thing about this job, how can I do that in the best way? And you know what, if you do that, you can cut down an awful lot of just garbage time. But a lot of that then is you have to do the sort of the really important and difficult mindset shift about what you value. And can you stop saying, oh my goodness, so-and-so worked over the weekend, they're such a good worker. And instead, like many of some of the people I meet in Europe is like, oh, you worked over the weekend? What's wrong with you? Why are you so inefficient? If we can change the cultural conversation, I think we can go a long way to changing, making work more effective, kind of shrinking it back into a more reasonable size and basically reclaiming our lives.
Totally. And I did a couple of episodes on the 4-day work week in my last season, including with the founder of 4-day work week global. And I just thought that was so fascinating. The idea that there's so much unproductive time. And what if we could buy that time back to live better lives and healthier lives? And I just think there's a lot more work to be done. And I know that you went to Iceland and learned that they were doing that well there. Can you just take a moment to share what you learned there?
Right. And I realized I didn't answer your question about Japan. So what I will say in just briefly in Japan, you have a real movement from the families of people who have died from karoshi or have gotten really sick, and young people and unions and labor leaders and labor lawyers. And it's really they are really pushing against the status quo. They're really trying to change. And one of the through litigation, through using through legislation, through using the media and public pressure, trying to change cultural attitudes as well as regulation, legislation, and policy. And this one young guy that I spoke to was it stayed with me all these years later. He just looked at me and he said, he was in the middle of a protest and he said, we just want a decent life. He didn't want what seemed to him the only option available to him. So you've got people who are really fighting for their lives in Japan, which I find really powerful, very moving. And in Iceland, I think what was so powerful there is, this is a country that went bankrupt in 2008 after the global meltdown. And what was so interesting is like out of that, you could say that was probably the lowest point, right? You're bankrupt and people are going to jail and you lose total faith in your leaders. But it really opened the opportunity for the entire country to think about, well, wait a minute, what's important to us? We just went off the cliff and we don't want to do that again. What really matters? What do we really want? If we could sort of design our economy and our country in any way, and now we have this opportunity where we can kind of start fresh, what would we do? And there was a real national conversation about the importance of well-being, human well-being, planetary well-being, and also gender equality. And so what they realized is they started doing small pilots to see, could they shorten the work week and what would happen? And they wanted to do it for a couple reasons. Because women still have so much of the unpaid responsibility of work, of care, and home, many women work part-time, and so they earn less. And then over a lifetime, you earn less, and you don't get as, then you have a lower, retirement and, less financial and economic security. And men spend more time at work, so women do more, spend less time at work at paid work, because they're doing so much unpaid work. So they thought if they could lower the work hours, would men be more likely to be involved with the unpaid work of care and home? Could that become more equal? And then could women and men have more equal time at work, which would then could you then equalize pay gaps and wealth gaps and promotion gaps? And what's so fascinating and very hopeful is that's what's happened. I talked to a lot of guys, a lot of men. I spent like a whole Friday with this one guy. He calls it his sacred Friday. He's a single father, and he can't wait. He finishes his work early. He can't wait to get home to spend the day with his kids and, the rest of the day with his kids. And they made pizza and, they just had a wonderful time together. And then you're not so stressed and you're not so rushed, and there's, kind of a more quality time that people were spending together. So men are spending more time. They're doing more of the unpaid work of care and home. And then because they lowered the hours, many women then were considered working full time. And so that ends up closing a lot of those income and wage and wealth gaps. And I talked to a whole lot of people that even though it's not like massive more amounts of time, just that much more time, they feel like there's just more breathing space. There's more time to really enjoy kind of the moment and the quality of life. So it was really powerful to see. And what I thought was so powerful about that is, in the United States and other countries, a lot of the talk of short work hours with no reduction in pay is really considered kind of for knowledge workers or a lot like tech people, and frankly, a lot of tech bros, if you will, sorry. And what I loved is that they made it available to childcare workers and school teachers and shift workers, people who worked at the local pools. And it takes more work to figure out how to do that, but it's the same principle. Like I spent some time at this one city office. And so a lot of times there were people who worked the front desk. And so you've got people who will say, oh my goodness, you could never do short work hours for a receptionist, or we always need that. And they figured out how to do it, and it went back to looking at their day and looking at their processes and realizing, nobody comes in between 8:15 and 8:45. So let's open the office a half hour later. And, nobody really comes in that last half hour of the day. So let's close the office earlier. So we could shorten the work week this way. And then they stagger their day so that the desk is always covered, the work is always done, but everyone has an opportunity to have that shorter work hours at the same level of pay. Work is more effective and their quality of life is improved.
Beautiful. And my hope is with the advent of AI all over the place that savings in time can be reused for better lives, that it just doesn't mean, okay, well, we'll even need less employees to do the work. Do you know what I mean? I'm hoping that time can be repurposed for better work lives.
Well, I think that that's going to be a big question in the future of work. And that is something that we really need to think about. What does a future with perhaps less work look like? And that's, I think, one of the main reasons we need to think about work in that much bigger way. And I also think we need to be thinking about, like, again, the common good and how do we prioritize human well-being? Because if you've got robots and AI doing a lot of the work, there will be new jobs created, no doubt. And so to me, the real question is, will the new jobs we create be big enough to support human life? And I hope that they are. And if they aren't, what are we going to do to make sure that people can not just survive, but flourish and thrive? Because isn't that the whole point? Is not to have a handful of people who could send rockets into space and, I don't know, own several private islands. Isn't the point that we're here on Earth to like make life better for all of us, to have a sense of shared prosperity?
I couldn't agree more, and I think the great divide between rich and poor is getting to be really alarming, and I think that that never goes in a good direction when it's so inequitable and so many people are suffering and struggling, and then other people have way more than they would ever need, which I think is an equally, challenging problem from a meaning perspective and a purpose perspective for those people. I mean, they have a tremendous obligation and responsibility with all that money.
Well, we live at a sort of a new gilded age. The levels of economic inequality are higher than they've been in a century. And, look at where it leads. A lot of political upheaval, a lot of feelings of, otherism and division. We're not in a good place, and economic inequality is a big part of it. And the thing is, there was a time when economic inequality was closing. 50 years ago, CEOs maybe made 30 times what the average worker did. Well, now the average is at 400 times and sometimes 1,000 times. So, again, it's because of the stories we've been telling ourselves and what we believe. Like, oh, well, we have to make the rich richer because then, they're the job creators and everything will trickle down. Well, you know what? After 50 years, it hasn't. And the real job creators are the workers. Because if you have a good job, then you can go to your local grocery store and you can buy the food that you need for your for your family. You can go to the local hardware store and buy stuff that you need to like do your DIY projects or whatever. You have a house where you can live. So you've got stability in your community. And then the grocery store person, they can expand and hire more people. Those are the job creators. Henry Ford knew that, which is why he raised wages at his Ford factory, for all of his faults, and he had many. He did raise wages, and he gave people more leisure time. He cut work hours, and he created a middle class that could then buy his product, which enabled, and certainly enriched him, but it also made people's lives better with shorter work hours, higher pay, and more leisure. And there's no reason we can't do it again.
Bravo. Well said. Now I'm going to turn the focus to you for our last couple of minutes, Bridget. What do you do to practice work-life wellness? I love that term. So being well in your work and well in your life, based on all the beautiful lessons that you've written about, what do you practice?
Well, how about this? I try and I practice and I make a lot of mistakes. And I think probably the most important thing that I've learned through all of this, because I've learned great stuff and there's all sorts of tips and tricks and I use them all and I love them, but I'm always screwing up. And I have workaholic tendencies and I overworked writing this book on overwork because I didn't take a book leave because I had kids in college and I had a mortgage to pay. And I love my job. And so I was doing like 2 or 3 jobs at once. Super bad. Don't do that. I'm really tired. So I guess what I would say is compassion, recognizing that I'm imperfect and I'm human and I'm going to screw up, but I'm going to get up tomorrow and I'm going to try again. And I have a meditation practice, sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's just like, okay, oops, I didn't do it. So I'm just going to take 3 breaths and that's enough, So I try to have some kind of like just calming down period. I love to run. I love to, move. I do, and I've had injuries. So this whole past year I haven't been able to run, but I walk. And that really helps ground me and just kind of get me into the present moment. So I do try to make time, I feel good if I eat well, and my husband calls me a rabbit. I'm very happy with my salads. I always bring my, carrots and cucumbers and cherry tomatoes and things like that, but it feels good. And so I think that's been important for me. I care so much about trying to make the world a better place. I can't do that when I'm burned out and exhausted. And I do get there, but then I do try to I do try to take care of myself as well. And some of that is like making sure I have time for my family, making sure I have time for like fun and my friends and, going to plays and going hiking and then going to a brewery afterwards, which is what we did 2 weeks ago. And Just making sure that there's time for fun and joy and wonder and awe.
I love that combination, a great hike and drinks with friends after. Love the sounds of that.
It's a super fun day.
Love the sounds of that, and I love your authenticity with being overworked, writing overworked. So, I thought that was brilliant. Um, so you have a podcast going. Can you just tell us a little bit about what people can learn about on your podcast?
So it's called the Better Life Lab podcast, and it's sort of, it's the art and science of living a full and healthy life, and sort of how work has shaped our lives and what we can, kind of what we can do, both at and I do this in the book as well, looking at how we change on the individual, organizational, and also societal levels. So the most recent season was looking at work stress and future of work issues. A lot of that is around power and inequality. But the main message of that is really recognizing that these are choices. The future is a choice. The way we create work systems and policies, these are choices. And, yes, use the tips and tricks to like put your oxygen mask on, but ultimately, become aware and be part of bigger change. So that would be probably the big message of the podcast. And we're hopefully going to do a new season looking at what is a well-being economy? What does work care and gender equality look like when you put, people's well-being rather than the stock market and GDP growth and and profits? What does that look like when you center that as the way you define the success of a country?
Love it. So we're gonna put that in the show notes. We'll share it in our monthly newsletter. So thank you for telling us more about that, Bridget. And my final question is, if you could have one wish for a better world when it comes to work and life, what would it be?
It always comes back to probably the main theme of everything I do, which is time. I wish for time. We're here on this earth for really a brief time. I think Oliver Berkman said it was something like 4,000 weeks, which seems, once you put it in those terms, you know, uh, so I think having more time, but having the ability to really sink in and enjoy the fullness of that time. That's what I wish for people.
Wonderfully put. Well, we've covered a lot of territory here. Thank you, Bridget, for sharing these insights. And I love how you really shared about what organizations can do, what human beings need, and societal, systemic policy changes that are needed. So I think that people are just going to love this newly launched book, Overwork. I highly recommend it. And all the best in your continued journeys of spreading these important messages and findings, Bridget.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful talking to you. And thank you for all the work you do.
You're welcome and stay well. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Where Work Meets Life. If you found this content valuable, please rate and review the episode and share with others who may benefit. Visit me on my website at drlaura.live and sign up for my monthly e-newsletter full of tips and resources. I'm also a passionate keynote speaker and would be delighted to speak with you on your speaking needs. Stay well.